Somewhere in the middle of the South China Sea, a handful of Filipino Marines wake up every morning on a ship that should have sunk decades ago. The vessel beneath their boots is held together by patches, prayers, and sheer national willpower. Outside, circling at close range, are some of the most powerful Coast Guard ships in the world, sent by a nation with the largest navy on Earth. These Filipino soldiers are not there by accident. They are there by design, living on a rusting World War II relic deliberately beached on a reef barely visible at high tide, because the Philippines made a decision 25 years ago that the only way to hold a claim in the South China Sea was to put human beings on it and refuse to leave. What started as a quiet act of territorial defiance has become one of the most dangerous standoffs anywhere on the planet, a confrontation that brings together international law, superpower rivalry, national pride, and the very real possibility that a single miscalculation could pull the United States into direct conflict with China. The waters at the center of this story are known in the Philippines as the West Philippine Sea. To China, they are simply the South China Sea, and Beijing insists that almost all of them belong to Chinese sovereignty under a sweeping boundary called the Nine-Dash Line, a claim that curves deep into the maritime territories of 5 other nations and covers over 3 million square kilometers of ocean. These are not empty waters. Roughly $5 trillion in global trade passes through the South China Sea every single year, making it one of the most commercially vital bodies of water on the planet. Beneath the waves lie vast reserves of oil, natural gas, and some of the richest fishing grounds in Asia. For the nations that border it, the South China Sea is not simply geography. It is survival, income, sovereignty, and identity compressed into one enormous maritime question that nobody has been able to answer peacefully. The legal backdrop to everything happening today traces back to a courtroom in The Hague. In 2013, the Philippines initiated an international arbitration case against China under the rules of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. 3 years later, in July 2016, the tribunal issued one of the most consequential rulings in the history of maritime law. It found in favor of the Philippines on 14 of the 15 points it examined, declaring that China's Nine-Dash Line had no legal basis under international law and that Beijing had no historic title to the resources within the area it claimed. The ruling should have settled the matter. Instead, China rejected it entirely, calling it null and void and refusing to participate in the proceedings at all. The arbitral award sits on the books as a landmark legal judgment that one of the world's most powerful nations simply decided did not apply to it, and the waters of the South China Sea remained exactly as contested as they had been before. Into that legal vacuum stepped a very unusual vessel. The BRP Sierra Madre began her life as an American warship during the Second World War, built in Indiana in 1944 and commissioned just weeks before the war in Europe ended. She served across the Pacific Theater, survived the conflict, passed through multiple hands, and eventually became part of the Philippine Navy. In 1999, Philippine President Joseph Estrada made a decision that would echo through the next quarter-century of regional geopolitics. Responding to China's occupation of Mischief Reef, Estrada ordered the Sierra Madre to be deliberately run aground on Second Thomas Shoal, a low-tide elevation in the Spratly Islands located roughly 104 nautical miles from the Philippine island of Palawan. A small detachment of Philippine Marines was stationed aboard. The message from Manila was simple and unmistakable: we are here, we intend to stay, and we are willing to back that claim with the presence of our own soldiers. China watched and waited. For years, the Sierra Madre sat in relative obscurity, a rusting curiosity that most of the world paid little attention to. The Marines on board lived in conditions that international observers described as genuinely difficult, with limited supplies, relentless heat, and a ship that deteriorated a little more with every passing monsoon season. Resupply missions by the Philippine Navy brought food, water, and replacement personnel, sustained by small boats navigating shallow waters that larger vessels could not safely enter.
Thank you, sir.
The arrangement was uncomfortable and unglamorous, but it held. Then, in the years following 2022, something shifted. As President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. took office in Manila and began moving the Philippines firmly back toward its alliance with the United States, China's posture around Second Thomas Shoal transformed. Coast Guard vessels appeared in greater numbers. Resupply missions that had once proceeded without incident began facing active interference. The standoff that had simmered for decades suddenly began to boil.
The year 2024 became the year the world truly started paying attention. What had previously been a slow-burning dispute conducted largely out of public view began generating international headlines with a frequency and urgency that could no longer be ignored. In March of that year, journalists from CNN joined a Philippine Coast Guard resupply mission to Second Thomas Shoal, the first time foreign reporters had been embedded with the fleet in decades. What they witnessed was a confrontation that captured the raw imbalance of power at the heart of this dispute. Filipino crews counted a total of 5 China Coast Guard vessels, 18 boats belonging to Beijing's maritime militia, and at a further distance, 2 Chinese naval vessels and a military helicopter. South China Morning Post. On the other side of that standoff were a handful of Philippine boats trying to deliver food and water to a handful of their countrymen living on a ship that was rusting into the sea. The images that came out of that mission shocked audiences around the world and forced a confrontation with a reality that diplomatic language had long managed to obscure. The tactics deployed by China against Philippine resupply vessels grew more severe with each passing month. The use of force by Chinese ships at Second Thomas Shoal increased in frequency and intensity in 2024, resulting in greater damage to Philippine vessels and injuries to personnel. Modern diplomacy water cannons, which can generate enough hydraulic force to knock a person off their feet and punch through thin wooden hulls, became a routine feature of resupply missions. Philippine vessels had their windshields shattered, their engines flooded, and their propulsion systems disabled. Consecutive barges from China Coast Guard water cannons ripped through the resupply vessel Aniza May 4, and the attack crippled the boat's propulsion, requiring an escort to tow the stricken vessel back to port. Crisis Group Filipino sailors on these missions were not combatants in any traditional military sense. They were servicemen trying to deliver rice, drinking water, and replacement personnel to a garrison that had no other means of being sustained. Each resupply run had become an act of national courage performed under conditions of genuine physical danger. The escalation reached its most alarming moment on June 17, 2024, in an incident that analysts and military observers immediately recognized as qualitatively different from everything that had come before. Chinese sailors armed with axes, pikes, and knives boarded a Philippine Navy inflatable boat, physically assaulted Philippine Marines, smashed their communication equipment, confiscated their weapons, and punctured the hull. East Asia Forum. A Filipino Marine lost part of a finger when a steel-hulled Chinese vessel rammed into his craft. Philippine Armed Forces Chief Romeo Bronner described what happened that day as piracy on the open sea and demanded reparations, while awarding the 80 Filipino personnel who participated in the mission the Order of Lapu-Lapu, the country's highest military honor named after the chieftain who defeated Ferdinand Magellan 5 centuries earlier. The symbolism was deliberate and unmistakable. Manila was reaching back into history to frame this confrontation in the same terms as the first great moment of Filipino resistance against a foreign power. Legal scholars and defense analysts watching those June events found themselves asking the same urgent question. Had China crossed the line that would force the United States to act? The 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty between the Philippines and the United States commits Washington to respond if Philippine armed forces, aircraft, or public vessels come under armed attack. Former Justice Antonio Carpio acknowledged the June 17 incident as an escalation, though he assessed it did not yet constitute an armed attack sufficient to formally invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty. South China Morning Post, that assessment, as careful and legally precise as it was, underscored just how close the situation had come to a threshold that would have carried consequences neither Manila nor Washington, and certainly not the broader world, was prepared for. The gap between what happened on that water and what would have triggered a formal military alliance response had narrowed to a distance that could be measured in degrees rather than miles. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., for his part, walked a line that reflected the extraordinary difficulty of his country's position. He was the leader of a nation of over 110 million people, occupying a chain of islands in one of the most strategically contested neighborhoods on Earth, facing pressure from the largest military force in Asia while simultaneously managing an economy that remained deeply intertwined with Chinese trade. Marcos stated publicly that the Philippines was not in the business of instigating conflict in the South China Sea, while also making clear that his country's calm disposition should never be mistaken for acceptance of what was being done to it. South China Morning Post, that formulation, firm in principle, restrained in action, became the defining posture of Philippine foreign policy in this era. It was a position built on the recognition that courage and caution are not opposites, and that a small nation can hold its ground without throwing the first punch.